Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and it's my privilege today to introduce to you Micaela Connery, who is the CEO of The Kelsey. Our talk today is discussing this theme of disabilities and housing and inclusive natives or inclusion natives. And Micaela is going to talk about that. And the title of the talk is actually Finding Our Way Home, Inclusive Housing for People with Disabilities. Micaela, thanks so much for joining us at New Wineskins for our tastings episodes. Really appreciate your time in the midst of everything going on with COVID and the like. So thank you.
No, happy to be here. Thanks for sharing our work and talking about some of these really important issues that only become more challenging and more important by the day.
And we'll have opportunity to talk about that as we proceed. So I'm going to first ask that you talk about The Kelsey. Where does that name come from? Because I know there's a story behind it, and I would like our viewers to hear about that story. And then also just a little bit about the heartbeat of The Kelsey, what The Kelsey's about.
Yeah. So the Kelsey first is named for my cousin Kelsey, who had significant disabilities. She and I were born 3 months apart. And so really my whole life was defined in disability inclusion, and actually not really defined in disability inclusion as anything special or unique, but it was just a part of our family that everything we did was inclusive of Kelsey because she was our cousin and our friend, just like anybody else. And so as a young person in elementary school and then high school, I was doing a lot around disability inclusion, whether it was in summer camps or religious ed programs at my church. And then when I was 15, founded a not-for-profit called Unified Theater.
15.
Yeah. Yeah. So I started as a club in my high school, not intending to start it as a not-for-profit. And that was inspired by Kelsey and the fact that people with disabilities like her were not included in our performing arts programs in schools. And did that for many years, and then realized as I graduated from high school, went to college, and became an adult, which I still feel like I'm becoming an adult. But as I went through those milestones in life, and Kelsey did, as well as other young people with and without disabilities that participated in Unified Theater, I realized that our communities were at some level investing time, energy, and thought into supporting inclusion of youth and teens with disabilities, but not really thinking about what happened to those people with disabilities when they became adults, and that the real barrier to inclusive community living as adults with disabilities was the lack of inclusive community-based housing. And so that was really what drove my inspiration to dive deep into what was both driving the lack of disability inclusive housing and what solutions could be could be created to solve it. And our mission at the Kelsey, as you've articulated, is really focused around accelerating and advocating for housing for people with and without disabilities of all incomes. We take a joint approach, which is that we both try to build models of disability inclusive community on the ground and actually develop this housing, and then couple that with broader advocacy and field building efforts to make sure that we are creating the systems and conditions and policies and structures that can make disability inclusive housing the norm beyond just our organization, but broadly across all communities. And we really focus in on kind of 3 key barriers and solutions in disability housing to make sure we are addressing the lack of affordability, creating deeply affordable mixed income communities that meet the range of affordability needs for people with and without disabilities, around accessibility in both how we site and design and create communities so that they are physically accessible in their location and their design and their building spaces. And then perhaps what I'm most passionate about is the inclusivity, which is that we program, operate, and staff buildings to be fully inclusive so that we are not further segregating and isolating people with disabilities or limiting their options in community integration, but actually building fully integrated communities that mix people with and without disabilities, and then programming those spaces to be actually connected, inclusive, mutually supportive communities through amenity spaces, building culture and program, and on-site staffing and programs that support that inclusive, connected community.
There's a
So
there's a lot there, to say the least. And I think so often we tend to pigeonhole issues and look at individuals in isolation or communities in isolation from all the facets that play into whatever the struggles are. And you just mentioned a variety of themes, people with disabilities, people without disabilities, living in community together, that's so important, that they're not isolated. If it's about inclusion natives, we need to make sure that we are about true inclusivity, including connecting people together who maybe at times otherwise would not be connected. Is that true?
yeah, absolutely. And I think also recognizing that this, when I first started this work around disability inclusive housing, I came across a lot of people, and I sat in a lot of these focus groups with parents or family members or service providers, not typically people with disabilities, but parents, family members, and service providers who would say, my adult child with disabilities needs X, Y, and Z in their housing. And it was often talking about how they needed the community to be supportive and connected, how they needed certain on-site amenities, how they needed the building to be designed and programmed in a certain way, how they wanted neighbors who looked out for each other and cared for each other. And as I sat in those discussions as a person in my 20s, I thought, well, what you're describing is actually where I'd like to live. And as I visited disability housing projects that weren't inclusive, I over and over thought, like, why are these separate communities? Why aren't they? There's really no reason for these to be standalone. They could so easily be integrated into the broader community. And in fact, not only will the people with disabilities benefit from that, and not only have people with disabilities demanded that their communities be created like that, but people without disabilities would desire and benefit from and thrive in these communities as well. So over and over again, we at the Kelsey say that what makes good disability inclusive design and building operations is just what makes good buildings for all of us.
Right. So it's not like some special structure, because then I would assume that we can end up looking once again by way of exclusion rather than inclusion. If we wouldn't want to live there, then really we're moving once again toward exclusion, right? And so I really find that really profound and strategic in so many ways. And we'll talk more about the strategy of the Kelsey and what you're doing there, but affordability, accessibility, and inclusion. And Greg Goodwin, who is the leader at the Cooney Foundation, had told me about your work, and they of course work in a lot of domains. Stevens Place up in Vancouver, Washington, and the Kelsey where you're working, just different ways of engagement related to housing, disability communities, or people with disabilities, and the like. Tell us a bit more about inclusion natives, would you please, Micaela?
Yeah, so as I started to do this work around housing, I started to realize that I was a member of a generation, and I'm on the older end of it, but that people who grew up in a post-IDEA world, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, when I talked to my parents, they, didn't see people with disabilities in their schools or communities. The idea of disability inclusion was unfortunately foreign to them because they operated under a time of separate institutions and separate schools and all of that. But for people my age and younger, inclusion is actually something that we've all, for the most part, not always perfect, but for the most part, grown up with since and even like my younger siblings from their preschools were disability inclusive. So the idea is that we have a new generation of people that have grown up as what we say inclusion natives. They have grown up in classrooms with people with and without disabilities, doing extracurricular programs with people with and without disabilities, and also with all different types of diversity. They've grown up in communities that, and we're seeing this increasing with racial diversity and LGBTQ rights and beyond. And so these young people have grown up both expecting and therefore valuing diversity and inclusion in the spaces that they occupy. And as I looked then on the other end of the spectrum of what the housing market was offering, there's no housing product that's offering that. In fact, we have people grow up in inclusive environments and with this huge core value of inclusion and diversity, and then they become adults and we stick them all in their separate isolated pods. And so really what the Kelsey aims to do is deliver a housing product that meets the needs of these inclusion natives who don't want a community despite the fact that it's inclusive. They want a community because it's inclusive. They want on the marketing materials that you don't need to sell them just the fact that it has a nice gym and a good coffee spot in the building, but actually that you get to live in a community that celebrates and values diversity, that your neighbors will bring a richness of difference, and that you'll get to interact with different people and have a community amongst those people, and that nobody's delivering on the product that young people who have grown up in these, as these inclusion natives desire and demand. And I'll just add one other piece that I think is super interesting and aligned of, we would align inclusion natives with also what we see of as socially conscious consumers. So we also see that same generation of people asking, sort of questioning capitalism and asking how what they consume in their products, whether that's restaurant or travel or consumer goods, and how the products that they pay for promote sort of a double bottom line and serve both a consumer purpose and a community purpose. And there's not really anyone delivering on that in the housing space, despite that that's what all of us spend most of our money on. And so how great would it be if you can offer a housing product that meets both, that both serves a double bottom line on the sort of financial side of it and meets this broader goal for a connected, supportive, diverse community. And it's not easy to do. And I think there's a lot of industry headwinds that make building that kind of product challenging. We actually, our financing sources incentivize you to create sort of distinct different types of communities that are beholden to one purpose and one bottom line overall. But I think that if we work over time, we can actually start to create these communities that are actually better for people and what people want to be putting their money in.
That's really striking. Again, so many facets, interconnected facets that are set forth in your work and what you've just shared here, Micaela. And I'm just, as I'm reflecting for our viewers on what you're sharing, themes that arise here, even when you think about COVID and you think about the George Floyd murder and the like, and how people, one in part because people have such isolation physically and else social isolation, even with COVID. But I think people have been more mindful in certain respects about these injustices in our society and not staying put in terms of, the outcry about the murder of George Floyd. And, when you think about people wanting inclusion, they want to live in inclusive communities. I think that's what we see going on in our society in so many ways. Would you agree?
Yeah. I do. And I think that what we're seeing in the time, particularly around this, really needed fight for racial justice and justice for Black Americans, I think we're seeing the way that social media has brought people together and brought people aware of issues. But I also think that one thing that can't be undervalued and undersold is how actual proximity to people can breed passion for those issues as well. And so I, am really excited that from a distance, a lot of people who, don't interact with people of different races or different incomes are stepping into this fight of very needed and joining it and raising their voices for justice. But how great would it be if actually you weren't talking about somebody that you heard about on social media as their rights mattering, but you're actually talking about your neighbor and the person that you live with and interact with every day, and that those communities, you don't have to go and walk, to a neighborhood far away to fight for these issues, because we just see such segregation pervasive through where we are, that again, social media is combating that a little bit to break down some of those barriers in a virtual sense. But my dream would be communities that actually are truly diverse all the time, and diverse without displacement, which I do think is an issue that continues to be challenging, of how, as we build diverse communities, typically when I've seen communities become diverse, it's because Black and brown people are being displaced and they're being gentrified. They're not actually being diversified. So it's a balance there. We're doing sort of a reverse gentrification process in some elements, where we look at sites and projects that are predominantly middle to high income, and predominantly, frankly, our neighborhood in San Jose is a very dominant white community and actually bringing in a diverse community there rather than doing the opposite. So there's lots of ways to, not that that's the only way to do it, but these issues of race and housing development are incredibly complex, but need to be really addressed head on. And I think that idea of proximity breeding passion also has to do with disability rights, because I think a lot about when the Affordable Care Act came under and continues to come under attack from this current administration. And I was in DC a couple of years ago, fighting for certain Medicaid funding and continuing to support Americans with disabilities through affordable care and through federal funding for key programs that keep people with disabilities alive and in the community. And I feel like when I try to talk to people around the value of certain programs like that, unless you have a family member with disability, sometimes you don't think about the value of them and how nice would it be. And what our hope at the Kelsey is that you no longer think of some of these federal programs as like this bureaucratic thing that benefits other people that you don't actually know, but, oh, hey, that's the program to make sure that my neighbor Sally has her staff come in and support her every day. And that's so needed. Why would anybody fight against that? And so by having these diverse, inclusive communities, you're able to, on some of these bigger policy issues, have them be truly close to home, because it matters to that neighbor that you have a relationship with and you see every day. And so I think we can talk about those on racial justice. I think we can obviously talk about them on disability justice. And not that connected, inclusive communities are kind of the, kumbaya panacea to all of these issues, but that they definitely are a step in the right direction.
Certainly. I mean, social segregation is such a huge issue in our society. And when you talk about even the Kelsey, it was your cousin, right?
Yeah.
Who shaped you. I have a niece whose sister died of leukemia, and she's a nurse working in a cancer ward on the East Coast because of her sister's influence on her and her connection with her. We think about racial connections and the like. And the social segregation is such a problem. And you mentioned before about how economics play in, and our consumer culture and the commodification of human identity, and how to reframe capital in a way that it serves community rather than community serving capital. And so there's so many factors that play in just such a short time. We've covered a lot of ground, but we're just scratching at the surface, right? And so I really am struck by what you're saying about capital. And as I was preparing for this, and as you know, I thought about the line from Sitting Bull: the white man can make anything, can create anything, but he doesn't know how to distribute it. You're really about redistribution. And for New Wineskins, we've been influenced by an African-American civil rights leader, John M. Perkins, who talks about relocation, reconciliation, and redistribution, where it's about holistic communal engagement and the like. Could you speak to some of your own theory about social change? And you have a document, and I don't want to get ahead, so to speak, in terms of, this is, I think, a draft form, if I'm not mistaken, in draft right now. But would you mind speaking to that issue of what you're working on in your framework of a robust theory of change and how that plays into all of this?
Yeah. Well, I want to get to the theory of change and first talk about sort of access to capital and how that all impacts together, because one of the things that I've been most struck about, both being in Silicon Valley and working on real estate, is sort of who gets to take risks, who gets to innovate, who gets to develop new programs. And it really has been fascinating to me. And one of the key pieces that I think about the Kelsey a lot is the role that philanthropy can have in redistributing the power to innovate and take risks. And so if I am, and I find this fascinating, like if I was like a for-profit, whether it's like some new innovator, and I think we've seen people do this well and poorly, like people get to take risks and they fail all the time. And they come and they promise this great financial upside and it actually never gets realized, but they've taken some really cool risks and advanced a sector forward. And we just don't see that happening at the same level in the not-for-profit and social change sector. And so as I have had to reconcile with my own role as a fundraiser, which is something that, I continue to work through, I recognize that my role as a fundraiser, and I have smarter mentors than me who help me think about this, which is that my role as a fundraiser is really about redistributing power and redistributing the right to innovate and take risks. So by unlocking, millions in individual philanthropic gifts, I'm actually allowing us to unlock new models of disability inclusive housing and allowing the communities where those develop to have new models of housing and try new things. And maybe, by the way, sometimes even fail or partially fail or come up just short of the mark. And that's actually how we advance a sector forward. And the reality is that things that are deeply tied to public funding, for a lot of very, prudent reasons, tend to be more risk averse, and they tend to require you to have a lot more experience and a proven track record, and that the model has been tested. And so, sure, that's where the public sector maybe will stay and needs to stay. And what we need is philanthropy to come in on the front end and actually help launch programs that the government hasn't quite picked up on yet, or that aren't at a stage yet where they're de-risked enough for government adoption. And so I really do think we need philanthropy to really re-examine what their role is in an ecosystem of social change. And to me, it's not necessarily coming in when an idea is fully baked and perfect and they're sustaining an org over time, but actually that they also need to come in at the beginning when things are really unknown and might not be successful, and are trying to pioneer a new model forward or push a sector forward or disrupt something, and being okay with, in the same way a venture capital model is, that they get that a certain amount of their portfolio will fail, that's actually okay in the philanthropic space too. And that, what we found at the Kelsey is that when we've had risk capital in the form of philanthropy, it's allowed us to take risks, iterate, and pivot really fast, so that actually our projects are set up for success. They look different in some ways than when we initially started, because we've had to pivot based on, of course, COVID market conditions. We've had to pivot based on what regulation will allow and not allow, or what the market is telling us is feasible. But we've been able to take those first steps and then make those quick pivots because philanthropy has stepped in early, and allowed us to do that. And we need them to keep stepping in, to push the sector forward.
And just on that point, Micaela, you mentioned before gentrification in Portland. There are huge issues with gentrification. It's perhaps the whitest city of its size, or in the United States, or larger, and the Central Corridor continues to be whitened, if you will. And it's, I think, bound up with profit margins and things of that sort. And one business leader, one urbanologist said actually that, urban renewal is Negro removal. And a business leader said in Portland, a Black person's property has no value until a white person owns it. And that same kind of philanthropy is needed in places like Portland as it relates to gentrification. Some of the dynamics are very similar, I think, from what you're saying, and you've alluded to it. Could you speak to that model of social change and the various factors bound up with affordability, accessibility, and inclusion that you're after with the Kelsey? Because I think you'd be excited about seeing other groups pick up on what you're doing to foster this inclusion with housing and other domains as well, as I hear you.
Yeah, I'll just touch on that other point around gentrification and sort of the issue of Negro removal in our urban centers, is that I do think, as to white, visibly non-disabled individuals, I think another part of this issue is to making sure we have both disabled leaders and leaders of color to advance some of these issues forward. And actually, part of my work is bringing on leaders with disabilities into our work, so that I'm actually not holding the power myself, but redistributing it. Indigenous leaders, who, and not to say that I don't have a role in this field, and I think I can continue to play a role, but that I'm very conscious of my own sort of privileged identity and how that impacts.
Just to that point, John M. Perkins talks about moving beyond charity. It's not enough to teach to fish or teach a person to fish, but people have to own the pond. And I think in your theory of change, it's about supporting people with their agency, being participants and affecting the change. People with disabilities. Is that true?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think
please speak further to that.
Yeah, so absolutely, that we, one disabled leader that I respect a lot said, what makes the Kelsey unique is interesting because you've involved people with disability since the start in being, advisors and paid staff and paid consultants and participants in your work. And I'm like, that should not make us unique. You should not be able to be a disability inclusive housing organization without having disabled leadership fundamental to your work and your strategy. And so we have just scratched the surface, frankly, in that area. And I'm proud of what we've done to differentiate us process, and I think we can do even more.
Mm.
We're excited this in August, we're launching a new program called Raise the Roof, which is actually a training program for people with disabilities to learn about housing development and housing advocacy, with the hope that they can then transition more into staff board and paid
Mm.
advocacy roles in the housing field, because we've been just so frustrated by the lack of
Mm.
disabled leaders in our work. And the fact that we don't have leaders with disabilities means that we don't have housing policies that reflect the needs of people with disabilities. And so the two are hand in hand, and something that we're working on. And I think, to go to your point of what, I started, as we talked about, to kind of come full circle, I started, Unified Theater as a young person. And now this is the second nonprofit that I'm starting. And a lot of people say, oh, you're like a serial social entrepreneur. That's what you do. And I've never really thought about myself in that way, because to me, a social entrepreneur really cares about the product overall and like what they put out there. And I do care about my product. I think that's, the highest quality and the best resident experience, or, the best after school program, or whatever it is. I'm deeply committed to the model and the product, and making that be both innovative and effective, and pushing an industry forward, and being the best in its class. But actually what I consider myself much more of is a social change leader, which is trying to figure out how we advance a system beyond one organization. And so I think all the time the Kelsey is thinking about, and it requires some finesse and walking a line sometimes, is we want to be, not the one of a kind, but the first of, or one of many, or a field leader that supports other people that are working in similar spaces. And so we see no competitors, but actually really try to take a Big Ten approach and open source a lot of our intellectual property, and work with, try to figure out how we work alongside what could be conceived as competitors or organizations that are applying for the same grants or funding.
Just to that point, if you don't mind, so often, and there's a biblical scholar, Walter Brueggemann, who talks about the fear of scarcity in conflict with, God's abundance. And you find this a lot. One finds this a lot about, okay, there are only so many pieces of the pie, make sure one gets one, and everyone's competing for it. I don't hear that from you at all. There's a creative synergy that if we do this together, it can actually multiply. That's what I hear from you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that we talk all the time about an abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset. That's a huge, core value in our organization, and that nobody benefits from, a competitive mindset around access to resources. Nobody benefits from oppression Olympics of saying my issue is more vulnerable than your issue, and therefore we should only fund this and not that. That ultimately ends up, actually benefiting the people who try to hold social change leaders down. It ultimately serves, capitalists who say, well, you organizations figure it out amongst yourselves of who actually has solved the issue, and we'll just wait over here. We actually need to speak truth to power as a united front of social change leaders and say, our collective issues are not the issue. The broader systems are the issue, and we all agree on that. So how do we move forward and solve that? And so the Kelsey, our theory of change also then relates back to this idea of building communities and changing systems, that we have this constant reinforcing loop of how do we build something that works on the ground? How do we then, as we're building it, note where the broader systems or society stands in our way or supports it? And then how do we, as we're building the community, use it to change those broader systems so it makes both our next community easier, but also makes those communities easier for anybody else who's trying to do it. And so I think that idea of, kind of a feedback loop of what's happening in practice and how do we use that to change the broader policies or systems is what, I think is a little bit differentiated, because you also have to be in a differentiation between a social entrepreneur. Therefore, I have to be a little bit less precious around my product, because actually I have to be willing to evolve my product over time to what the people who experience that product or what the systems require. And so that there are certain things that we won't compromise on. We're always going to be disability inclusive. We have defined very clearly kind of what makes a Kelsey community, but things are not as precious as like, we need to be this very specific thing, because we're most interested in what can advance over time to serve the most number of people the most effectively.
I think for those who are watching this, I hope we are not thinking, well, this is great for the work related to disabilities. Well, of course it is. but it has import across the board. There's not one facet of society that what you've shared, Micaela, it doesn't touch. It touches every facet of society. And so I'm hopeful that people, if they're dealing with gentrification issues, if they're dealing with nonprofits in communities that are vulnerable across the board and beyond, would really take note, because this is a very strategic model of social change that you're pursuing that is a catalyst in so many spheres. I mean, I'm certainly not 15. I haven't been 15 for a long, long time. 51 plus is what I'm thinking. And yet I've gotten an education today in a big way. I know your time is limited and you have to get out there and do more social change and catalyzing, Micaela, but I want to thank you for your time. But I wanted to also give you the opportunity in closing to share with our viewers where they can find out more about the Kelsey and to support your work, to learn from your work, to collaborate with your work here in your area, but also beyond. So could you just share that before we close?
Yep. So the easiest place to go is thekelsey.org. And that's our website and has information about all of our programs that we're running. And there's really 3 different ways people can get involved. The first is obviously we are always fundraising. So we welcome donors and supporters and foundations like the Cooney Foundation who can step in and support our work in big, medium, and small ways. The second is that on that website, if you are a person that is interested in creating this type of housing or working in this related, work, we host office hours, and we also have an open source Learn Center that's free to access where we share all of our ideas and information. So there's something on there about inclusion natives, for example. And so feel free to access those resources and also reach out if there are joint kind of research or information that you would like to see put out there that we could produce with you or produce for you. And then the third area is that, like I mentioned, we're working on different, we have ongoing sort of programs and events that advance our goal of inclusive housing, whether those be inclusion hours or a Raise the Roof program or some other programs that we run throughout the year. So on our website, there's something called our field notes that you can sign up for updates on all of those different events.
Wow, thank you so much, Micaela. Again, I'm here with Micaela Connery, the CEO of The Kelsey. And again, the website, once again?
Thekelsey.org.
Thekelsey.org. Micaela, thanks so much for your time and all the best to you in this vital, vital work, especially in such times as we're facing now with COVID and racial disparities and upheaval in our society. Such a vital, important work that you're leading. So thank you so much.
Yeah, happy to join. Thanks for having me.
Paul Lewis-Metzger, Director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, signing off. Thanks for joining Micaela Connery and myself today for New Wine Tastings. All the best to you.